My name is Evan, and I'm representing the MIT Software Design Group. I'm going to jump right into our work, which is on creating a new framework to more effectively define and think about dark patterns. Many of you have likely come across dark patterns, designs on the internet that make you feel like you're being tricked or pressured into something. I often describe them as sketchy designs that just feel bad, manipulative, deceptive. Whether it's UI colors that are designed to make you not see important buttons, or an online newspaper requiring you to call them to unsubscribe, these designs are common across the internet. They cause significant harm individually, for example, costing users money, but can also cause harm in aggregate, a collection of small designs all making a user's experience consistently worse. Sometimes these designs are egregious, but sometimes their classification as dark patterns isn't so clear-cut. These are two designs that have been submitted by users to a site that collects examples of dark patterns. On the left, we have a recurring notification about your Mac storage being full, one that comes back even after you hit close. Some users may see this as dark, feeling pressured to pay for iCloud storage, finding it frustrating they don't have the autonomy to dismiss it forever. But for other users, this is useful, giving them critical information and options to resolve the issue. On the right, we have a streaming site automatically playing the next episode when we finished a show. On one hand, this is super useful if I'm binging a show and want to see the next episode. It serves a pretty common user need. On the other hand, it's an example of a platform opting me into a decision that may be bad for my mental health that keeps me using their system. There's been an abundance of research on identifying and evaluating both egregious and more ambiguous dark patterns. Two approaches that often show up are taxonomies and underlying principles. In taxonomies, examples of dark patterns are grouped into types, giving us shared language to describe patterns, collecting a plethora of examples, and raising awareness. But what they don't help us to understand is the nuances of what is acceptable or not. We can say that a streaming service falls into pre-selection, but how do we know if this specific form of pre-selection is acceptable? Further, taxonomies tell designers what to avoid, but they don't suggest better alternatives, leaving designers without positive patterns to follow. Underlying principles help us understand the mechanisms that are behind the patterns in taxonomies. To borrow a phrase from Mather et al., they question what exactly makes a dark pattern dark. But they often require assumptions about what the default or acceptable state is. For example, Mather et al. Defined dark patterns as modifications of choice architecture. This streaming surface definitely sets a choice architecture for the user, one that promotes watching another episode. But to know whether that's a modification, we would first need to know what the original or default choice architecture is, which isn't defined anywhere. Our contribution extends this existing work, providing a framework and a language that can fill some of the gaps. Our framework for evaluating designs is grounded in the expectations that users have for how applications will work, expectations that come from their past interactions with similar applications. We then provide a language for articulating these user expectations as standards that designers can follow. Before I dive into our new definition of dark pattern, let me take a step back to outline some basic context you'll need. Our work relies on concepts. Concepts are what make up all applications. A social media app is made of concepts such as post, comment, upvote, friend, notification, and so on. These concepts are generic. They're frequently reused in many different contexts across applications. When you open Instagram for the first time, you likely didn't need the concept of a comment explained to you. You've seen it many times before and know what to expect. These concepts are represented by the user interface. Even if a concept looks different, a comment on Instagram versus a cooking blog, they have the same underlying behavior. In our work, we identify that there are three variations of a concept that are present when a user interacts with an application. The first is the observed concept. From looking at the user interface, what functionality does the user interpret as there being in an application? This is distinct from the implemented concept. The implemented concept is what functionality is actually programmed in. When a concept is represented well on a user interface, the observed will closely match the implemented. But in the example dark pattern from earlier, while the implemented concept does contain the unsubscribe action, it's programmed in, it is technically available, the user's observation of the concept likely will not include the ability to unsubscribe. Finally, we have the expected concept. As I mentioned, concepts are frequently reused across the internet. When you open a new app, you carry your expectations for how upvoting works, how notifications work, and so on. The expected concept is the functionality that the user expects based on their interactions with that concept elsewhere in the past. In this case, a user likely expects that when they sign up for a mailing list, they can unsubscribe via the emails they get from it. This brings us to our new two-part definition of a dark pattern. The first is basically that the way the app works or the way the user perceives it to work is different than what the user thought it would be. More technically, the implemented or observed concept deviates from the expected concept. The second half is that this deviation benefits the designer or system owner to the detriment of the user. Notably, unlike prior approaches, our definition does not rely on identifying the psychological techniques used or on matching violations to a taxonomy. Instead, it grounds the definition in user expectations, which are developed from their past interactions with the world around them. Let's walk through a few quick examples using an online shopping cart. First, imagine a shopping cart where items are spontaneously added without the user taking any action. This behavior clearly fulfills the first part of the definition. Based on all past interactions with shopping carts, we expect items to only be added to our cart when we put them there. It also fulfills the second. This would cause financial harm to the user to the benefit of the shop. Now, consider a shopping cart where items are only added by the user, but it only shows shipping costs at the end. Again, this hiding of information harms the user to the benefit of the shop. But this behavior is how almost all shopping carts behave. Therefore, most users would find it to be solidly within their expectations, making this not a dark pattern. On the other hand, imagine a shopping cart where shipping costs were calculated and updated incrementally as more items are added, showing the current cost to the user. This may surprise users, but it's to their benefit and not their harm, so not a dark pattern. To return to our ambiguously dark example, our definition reveals that whether this design feels dark to a user will depend on the user's expected concept. When this design was reported 7 years ago, many users like Alice may have been operating under the model of playing a DVD on a video player. Another episode starting to play would break their expectations. Whether or not the design feels dark would then depend on whether they felt it was more beneficial because they wanted to watch more, or harmful to the platform's benefit because they felt like they were being trapped. On the other hand, someone like Bob, who grew up with this behavior, who expects this to be how a video player works, wouldn't find this design dark. This definition is very dependent on individual user expectations, which means designers would still struggle to look to it for guidance on what to do. This presents a new need, a way to create standards via articulating these user expectations. Concept catalogs are collections of standardized concepts, which take varying implicit user expectations and document a specific concept, providing a concrete reference for what behavior applications are expected to have. There are many options for how concept catalogs can be developed. There likely would not be a single unified catalog. But one can imagine companies documenting the standards they abide by, along with standard boards, company consortiums, even policymakers, defining, publishing, and debating standards as guidance for others. In the context of concept catalogs, the definition of a dark pattern can then be refined, comparing the observed or implemented concept to the standard concept, rather than the more nebulous expected concept. To evaluate our framework for defining dark patterns and the idea of a concept catalog, we ran 3 small evaluations in our paper. First, in order to confirm that our framework can successfully describe the dark patterns that other approaches have identified, we redescribed an existing dark pattern taxonomy in terms of our own framework. We found that our framework can successfully redescribe existing dark patterns. Its strengths lie in analyzing more systemic behavior and recognizing when the feeling of a design being dark will vary from user to user. On the other hand, it was weaker at describing nuances of visual design that result in dark patterns. Other approaches have more specific UI-focused language. Next, through applying our framework in a case study of 3 similar but different e-commerce websites, we evaluated whether we can capture nuances not captured by existing frameworks. One example is that since our framework doesn't rely on designs being manipulative or deceptive, we found that there are some expectations so strong that no amount of open communication and positive intent can change what functionality users expect, and therefore avoid feeling dark. Finally, through conducting a survey of concept functionality on various e-commerce sites, we found that in fact websites do share common functionality patterns that a concept catalog can capture. The reuse of concepts and common functionality across the internet, and the ability to succinctly describe the behavior of concepts is a key part of our approach. Together, these 3 evaluations showed us that our framework can redescribe existing dark patterns, capture new nuances, and document functionality patterns of real applications. Now, in these last few minutes, I'm going to reflect a bit more broadly on some of the bigger strengths and limitations of our approach, ending with some thoughts around future work. First, let's talk about some strengths. The biggest difference in our approach is that while prior work often takes expectations as a given, our approach recognizes that these expectations need to be defined and can't come from abstract analysis. They come from how applications currently work. Concepts then allow us to break down this idea of how applications currently work into concrete modular units of functionality. These concepts then let us focus on positive patterns that practitioners can build upon, rather than adding to an ever-growing list of negative examples to avoid. Another strength is that we address both user interface dark patterns, but also dark patterns that arise at a deeper, more conceptual level of an application's functionality. Finally, our definition combines both procedural and substantive criteria. The first half, comparing expected or standardized concepts to implemented and observed concepts, is procedural, a concrete set of conditions to check. The latter, considering the harm to users, is substantive. It's very situated within the context of a user's values, of society's values. We found in our work that both parts are needed to capture dark patterns. No catalog, no underlying principle will be complete without also considering the normative values at play. Our work has 2 big limitations that are very top of mind. Both of them also point to future work, to the need to explore how we can mitigate and take into account these limitations. The first is that user expectations and perceptions of harm can differ from person to person, as can the values of a society more broadly. This necessarily means that the definition of a dark pattern cannot be universal. For example, consider if a restaurant customer finds on their final bill that they've been charged for their glass of water. If they're an American in an American restaurant, they likely would be shocked and offended by this sneaky behavior. In contrast, a European in Europe might think nothing of it. And of course, even this is a generalization. Concepts help us capture commonalities in expectations, and concept catalogs even more so. But there are still nuances. The same goes for how people perceive harm. User values can often be in conflict with each other, and in conflict with the common good of society. The second limitation is that while our definition inherently relies on user expectations, sometimes users can have expectations that are harmful. For example, people may have low expectations for the privacy of their data, but that doesn't make designs that abuse users' privacy acceptable. On the front of future work, I want to leave you all with one last thought. Our focus on user expectations and perception of harm revealed that often when dark patterns are discussed, they actually are falling into 2 different categories. There's when a design will feel dark to a given user, or when a design is problematic in a broader sense. The former is tied closely to individual user expectations and values, while the latter is tied to the values and expectations of society. While they can overlap, we found that differentiating between the 2 is helpful to evaluate design, and we encourage you to consider this in future work. Thank you all for listening.